Plague by Camus. This is part 4, chapter 5. All Souls' Day that year was very different from what it had been in former years. True, the weather was seasonable. There had been a sudden change, and the great heat had given place to a mild autumnal air. As in other years, a cool wind blew all day, and big clouds raced from one horizon to the other, trailing shadows over the houses upon which fell again, when they had passed, the pale gold light of a November sky. The first waterproofs made their appearance. Indeed, one was struck by the number of glossy, rubberized garments to be seen. The reason was that our newspapers had informed us that 200 years previously, during the great pestilences of southern Europe, the doctors wore oiled clothing as a safeguard against infection. The shops had seized this opportunity of unloading their stock of out-of-fashion waterproofs, which their purchasers fondly hoped would guarantee immunity from germs. But these familiar aspects of All Souls' Day could not make us forget that the cemeteries were left unvisited. In previous years, the rather sickly smell of chrysanthemums had filled the trams, while long lines of women could be seen making pilgrimage to the places where members of the family were buried, to lay flowers on the graves. This was the day when they made amends for the oblivion and dereliction in which their dead had slept for many a long month. But in the plague year, people no longer wished to be reminded of their dead, because indeed they were thinking all too much about them as it was. There was no more question of revisiting them with a shade of regret and much melancholy. They were no longer the forsaken, to whom one day in the year you came to justify yourself. They were intruders whom you would rather forget. That is why the Day of the Dead this year was tacitly but willfully ignored. As Cottard dryly remarked, Tarrou noted that the habit of irony was growing on him more and more. Each day was for us a Day of the Dead. And in fact, the bale fires of the pestilence were blazing ever more merrily in the crematorium. It is true that the actual number of deaths showed no increase, but it seemed that plague had settled in for good at its most virulent, and it took its daily toll of deaths with the punctual zeal of a good civil servant. Theoretically, and in the view of the authorities, this was a hopeful sign. The fact that the graph, after its long rising curve, had flattened out, seemed to many, Dr. Richard for example, reassuring. "The graph's good today," he would remark, rubbing his hands. To his mind, the disease had reached what he called high water mark. Thereafter it could but ebb. He gave the credit of this to Dr. Castell's new serum, which indeed had brought off some quite unlooked-for recoveries. While not dissenting, the old doctor reminded him that the future remained uncertain. History proved that epidemics have a way of recrudescing when least expected. The authorities, who had long been desirous of giving a fillip to the morale of the populace, had so far been prevented by the plague from doing so, now proposed to convene a meeting of the medical corps and ask for an announcement on the subject. Unfortunately, just before the meeting was due to take place, Dr. Richard too was carried off by the plague, then precisely at high water mark. The effect of this regrettable event, which, sensational as it was, actually proved nothing, was to make our authorities swing back to pessimism as inconsequently as they had previously indulged in optimism. As for Castell, he confined himself to preparing his serums with the maximum of care. By this time, no public place or building had escaped conversion into a hospital or quarantine camp, with the exception of the prefect's offices, which were needed for administrative purposes and committee meetings. In a general way, however, owing to the relative stability of the epidemic at this time, RIA's organizations were still able to cope with the situation. Though working constantly at high pressure, the doctors and their helpers were not forced to contemplate still greater efforts. All they had to do was to carry on automatically, so to speak, their all but superhuman task. The pneumonic type of infection, cases of which had already been detected, was now spreading all over the town. One could almost believe that the high winds were kindling and fanning its flames in people's chests. The victims of pneumonic plague succumbed much more quickly after coughing up blood-stained sputum. This new form of the epidemic looked like being more contagious as well as even more fatal. However, the opinions of experts had always been divided on this matter. For greater safety, all sanitary workers wore masks of sterilized three-ply muslin. On the face of it, the disease should have extended its ravages, but the cases of bubonic plague showing a decrease, the death rate remained constant. Meanwhile, the authorities had another cause for anxiety in the difficulty of maintaining the food supply. Profiteers were taking a hand and purveying at enormous prices essential foodstuffs not available in the shops. The result was that poor families were in great straits, while the rich went short of practically nothing. Thus, whereas plague by its impartial ministrations should have promoted equality amongst our townsfolk, it now had the opposite effect, and thanks to the habitual conflict of cupidities, exacerbated the sense of injustice rankling in men's hearts. They were assured, of course, of the inevitable equality of death, but nobody wanted that kind of equality. Poor people who were feeling the pinch thought still more nostalgically of towns and villages in the nearby countryside, where bread was cheap and life without restrictions. Indeed, they had a natural, if illogical, feeling that they should have been permitted to move out to these happier places. The feeling was embodied in a slogan, shouted in the streets and chalked up on walls: bread or fresh air. This half-ironical battle cry was the signal for some demonstrations, which, though easily repressed, made everyone aware that an ugly mood was developing amongst us. The newspapers, needless to say, complied with the instructions given them. Optimism at all costs. If one was to believe what one read in them, our populace was giving a fine example of courage and composure. But in a town thrown back upon itself, in which nothing could be kept secret, no one had illusions about the example given by the public. To form a correct idea about the courage and composure talked about by our journalists, you had only to visit one of the quarantine depots or isolation camps established by our authorities. As it so happens, the narrator, being fully occupied elsewhere, had no occasion to visit any of them, and must fall back on Theroux's diary for a description of the conditions in these places. Theroux gives an account of a visit he made, accompanied by Rambert, to the camp located in the municipal sports ground. The sports ground lies on the outskirts of the town, between a street along which runs a tram line and a stretch of wasteland extending to the extreme edge of the plateau on which Oran is built. It was already surrounded by high concrete walls, and all that was needed to make escape practically impossible was to post sentries at the 4 entrance gates. The walls served another purpose. They screened the unfortunates in quarantine from the view of people on the road. Against this advantage may be set the fact that the inmates could hear all day, though they could not see them, the passing trams, and recognize by the increased volume of sound coming from the road the hours when people had knocked off work or were going to it. And this brought home to them that the life from which they were debarred was going on as before, within a few yards of them, and that those high walls parted 2 worlds as alien to each other as 2 different planets. Theroux and Rambert chose a Sunday afternoon for their visit to the sports ground. They were accompanied by Gonzalez, the football player, with whom Rambert had kept in contact, and who had let himself be persuaded into undertaking, in rotation with others, the surveillance of the camp. This visit was to enable Rambert to introduce Gonzalez to the camp commandant. When they met that afternoon, Gonzalez's first remark was that this was exactly the time when, before the plague, he used to start getting into his football togs. Now that the playing fields had been requisitioned, all that was of the past, and Gonzalez was feeling, and showed it, at a loose end. This was one of the reasons why he had accepted the post proposed by Rambert, but he made a condition that he was to be on duty during weekends only. The sky was overcast, and glancing up at it, Gonzalez observed regretfully that a day like this, neither too hot nor rainy, would have been perfect for a match. And then he fell to conjuring up as best he could the once familiar smell of embrocation in the dressing rooms, the stands crowded with people, the colored shirts of the players showing up brightly against the tawny soil, the half-time lemons or bottled lemonade, the titillated parched throats with 1,000 refreshing pinpricks. Theroux also records how on the way, as they walked the shabby outer streets, The footballer gave kicks to all the small, loose stones. His object was to shoot them into the vent holes of the gutters, and whenever he did this, he would shout, "Bravo! Goal!" When he had finished his cigarette, he spat the stub in front of him and tried to catch it on his toe before it touched the ground. Some children were playing near the sports ground, and when one of them sent a ball towards the three men, Gonzalez went out of his way to return it neatly. On entering the ground, they found the stands full of people. The playing field was dotted with tents, inside which one had glimpses of bedding and bundles of clothes or rugs. The stands had been kept open for the use of the internees in hot or rainy weather, but it was a rule of the camp that everyone must be in his tent at sunset. Shower baths had been installed under the stands, and what used to be the players' dressing rooms converted into offices and infirmaries. The majority of the inmates of the camp were sitting about on the stands. Some, however, were strolling on the touchlines, and a few, squatting at the entrances of their tents, were listlessly contemplating the scene around them. In the stands, many of those slumped on the wooden tiers had a look of vague expectancy. What did they do with themselves all day? True, asked Rambert. Nothing. Almost all, indeed, had empty hands and idly dangling arms. Another curious thing about this multitude of derelicts was its silence. When they first came here, there was such a din you couldn't hear yourself speak, Rambert said, but as the days went by, they grew quieter and quieter. In his notes, Theroux gives what to his mind would explain this change. He pictures them in the early days bundled together in the tents, listening to the buzz of flies, scratching themselves, and whenever they found an obliging listener, shrilly voicing their fear or indignation. But when the camp grew overcrowded, fewer and fewer people were inclined to play the part of sympathetic listener. So they had no choice but to hold their peace and nurse their mistrust of everything and everyone. One had indeed a feeling that suspicion was falling, dew-like, from the grayly shining sky over the brick-red camp. Yes, there was suspicion in the eyes of all. Obviously, they were thinking there must be some good reason for the isolation inflicted upon them, and they had the air of people who were puzzling over their problem and are afraid. Everyone Theroux set eyes on had that vacant gaze and was visibly suffering from the complete break with all that life had meant to him. And since they could not be thinking of their death all the time, they thought of nothing. They were on holiday. But worst of all, Theroux writes, is that they're forgotten and they know it. Their friends have forgotten them because they have other things to think about, naturally enough, and those they love have forgotten them because all their energies are devoted to making schemes and taking steps to get them out of the camp. And by dint of always thinking about these schemes and steps, they have ceased thinking about those whose release they're trying to secure. And that too is natural enough. In fact, it comes to this: nobody is capable of really thinking about anyone, even in the worst calamity. For really to think about someone means thinking about that person every minute of the day, without letting one's thoughts be diverted by anything. By meals, by a fly that settles on one's cheek, by household duties, or by a sudden itch somewhere. There are always flies and itches. That's why life is difficult to live. And these people know it only too well. The camp president came up. A gentleman named Othon, he said, would like to see them. Leaving Gonzalez in the office, he led the others to a corner of the grandstand where they saw Monsieur Othon sitting by himself. He rose as they approached. The magistrate was dressed exactly as in the past and still wore a stiff collar. The only changes Theroux noted were that the tufts of hair over his temples were not brushed back, and that one of his shoelaces was undone. Monsieur Othon appeared very tired, and not once did he look his visitors in the face. He said he was glad to see them and requested them to thank Dr. Rieux for all he had done. Some moments of silence ensued. Then, with an effort, the magistrate spoke again. I hope Jacques did not suffer too much. This was the first time Theroux heard him utter his son's name, and he realized that something had changed. The sun was setting and flooding through a rift in the clouds. The level rays raked the stands, tinging their faces with a yellow glow. No, Theroux said, no, I couldn't really say he suffered. When they took their leave, the magistrate was still gazing towards the light. They called in at the office to say goodbye to Gonzalez, whom they found studying the duty roster. The footballer was laughing when he shook hands with them. Anyhow, I'm back in the good old dressing room, he chuckled. That's something to go on with. Soon after, when the camp president was seeing Theroux and Rambert out, they heard a crackling noise coming from the stands. A moment later, the loudspeakers, which in happier times seemed to announce the results of matches or to introduce the teams, or served to announce the results of matches or to introduce the teams, informed the inmates of the camp that they were to go back to their tents for the evening meal. Slowly, everyone filed off the stands and shuffled towards the tents. After all were under canvas, 2 small electric tracks of the kind used for transporting luggage on railway platforms began to wend their way between the tents. While the occupants held forth their arms, 2 ladles plunged into the 2 big cauldrons on each truck and neatly tipped their contents into the warm, waiting not sure, the waiting dishes, I suppose. Then the truck moved on to the next tent. Very different, Theroux remarked. The camp president beamed as he shook hands. Oh, very efficient, Theroux remarked. The camp president beamed as he shook hands. Yet, isn't it? We're great believers in efficiency at this camp. Dusk was falling. The sky had cleared and the camp was bathed in cool, soft light. Through the hush of evening came a faint tinkle of spoons and plates. Above the tents, bats were circling, vanishing abruptly into the darkness. A train car squealed on the points outside the walls. Poor Monsieur Ton, Theroux murmured as the gate closed behind them. One would like to do something to help him, but how can you help a judge? I'm going to stop here for now.